Welcome, my friend, to another quiet journey into the long corridors of the past. This time, we drift northward across cold seas and rugged coasts into the world of the Vikings, a people remembered for their raids and longships, but whose story is far richer than battle alone. Tonight, as you settle in and let the day fade, we will wander through their myths, their daily lives, their journeys across oceans, and the odd corners of their world that history books sometimes leave behind. Settle in now. The day is over. The night is yours. And it is time to let the weight of the present slip quietly away. This is Ancient After Dark. And let's begin this journey. The world of the Vikings stretched across Scandinavia, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and the scattered islands beyond. It was a land of fjords cut deep into stone, forests of pine and birch, and winters so long that summer sometimes felt like a rumor. Life here was shaped by the seasons. When the sun lingered for endless days, there was farming and feasting. When the nights grew heavy and long, there were fires, stories, and the slow patience of survival. The people who lived there learned to bend themselves to this rhythm, to grow food in soil thin and rocky, to herd sheep and goats on steep hillsides, and to fish in waters that were often more generous than the land. It is easy to imagine Vikings only as raiders, men with axes and ships, but most were farmers first. Their lives were measured by the harvest, the herd, and the weather. In longhouses built of timber and turf, families, servants, and livestock shared one roof, the air smoky with the hearth fire, the floor worn by years of use. It was not elegant, but it was warm, though perhaps less so if you were sitting down to supper with a cow breathing over your shoulder. Still, the sea always called. The longship was their answer to that call, long and sleek, light enough to carry over land, shallow enough to climb rivers. It was a farmer's cart, a merchant's wagon, and a warrior's horse all in one. Few inventions in history carried so much versatility, so much possibility. A single vessel could bring trade, exploration, or ruin, depending on how the oars were pulled. The first great shock came in 793 at a monastery called Lindisfarne. The monks there rose that morning as they always did, to prayer, to silence, to the slow copying of sacred texts. And then the horizon darkened with ships, prows carved with dragon heads, sails full of wind. To the monks it must have seemed as though monsters had crawled out of the sea itself. The raiders struck, plundered, and vanished, leaving behind ruin and fear that the north had woken. But monasteries were tempting not only for their remoteness. They were rich, poorly defended, and full of treasures that glittered in the firelight. Gold chalices, reliquaries, fine wine. To a Viking eye, they looked less like holy sanctuaries and more like the medieval equivalent of a treasure chest left unlocked. Europe remembered the terror, but the Vikings remembered the silver. They were more than raiders, though. The same ships that struck Lindisfarne sailed rivers into Russia, down to the Black Sea, even into the markets of Baghdad. They carried furs, amber, walrus ivory, and slaves. They returned with silver coins, silks, glass, and spices. Imagine a Norse farmer, used to dark winters and fish soup, staring at a pile of cinnamon, wondering whether it was worth more to eat, to burn, or simply to brag about. Their gods traveled with them too. Odin, the one-eyed wanderer, who traded sight for wisdom. Thor, whose hammer thundered against giants and storm. Loki, sly and shifting, always present, never trustworthy. These were gods who quarreled, feasted, and failed. They were not distant perfection. They were reflections of men, exaggerated into myth. The world they promised was not safe, for even the gods would one day fall in Ragnarok, but it was familiar, full of struggle, humor, and inevitability. In long winters, sagas were told in firelit halls, their rhythm steady, their humor sharp, their truths unvarnished. Heroes were brave, but also flawed. Kings were mighty, but sometimes foolish. Even gods could be mocked. The sagas were not sermons. They were entertainment, memory, and lesson all at once. They reminded listeners that greatness could fall and weakness could endure, that life was uncertain, but always worth the telling. Disputes were not always solved by the sword. In Iceland, a quarrel could be settled by a contest of insults, standing before others and trading barbs until one man faltered. This was called flyting. And if it sounds familiar, it is because it was the Viking ancestor of the modern rap battle, only with fewer rhymes and more sheep references. It is strangely comforting to know that even 1,000 years ago, men believed reputation could be won or lost not only by blade, but by wit. Daily life was practical. Meals were bread, porridge, dried fish, and soups thick with onions and leeks. Dairy was constant. Butter, cheese, skyr. It may not sound impressive, but it was fuel enough for farming, rowing, and war. Feasts were another matter. Roasted meats, mead in carved horns, ale flowing until the hall swayed. In sagas, the man who drank bravely could be honored as much as the man who fought bravely, though in both cases, falling over at the wrong time was disastrous. Their clothes, too, were more colorful than legend admits, dyed in blues, reds, and yellows, decorated with bronze, silver, and amber jewelry. A raiding crew might have looked less like shadows of death and more like a particularly determined folk festival, with axes in hand instead of banners. It gave their image both terror and spectacle, strange to behold, hard to forget. And no, they did not wear horned helmets. That was an invention centuries later. Real helmets were plain iron caps or hardened leather, practical above all. Horns would have been an irritation. Picture 40 men rowing for hours, each silently wishing the neighbor's ridiculous headgear would stop poking them in the ribs. Romance fades quickly when your battle helmet is stabbing your friend in the ear. Viking women had more rights than many of their neighbors. They could own property, manage farms, divorce husbands, and even reclaim dowries. A husband who failed to provide or simply drank too much might find himself dismissed. It must have encouraged more than a few men to stack firewood with unusual energy. The sagas remember women not only as wives and mothers, but sometimes as warriors, leaders, and voices of reason. They were also far cleaner than most give them credit for. Vikings bathed weekly, carried combs, razors, and tweezers. English chroniclers complained bitterly that Viking men were too attractive, too well-groomed, and far too interesting to local women. The first case, perhaps, where personal hygiene was considered a weapon more dangerous than the sword. Many of their journeys ended not in raids, but in settlement. They farmed in England, traded in Dublin, and ruled in Normandy. In Constantinople, they became the Varangian Guard, bodyguards to the Byzantine emperors, tall, fair-haired men with axes, standing in silk-draped halls, muttering about the heat, fiercely loyal, far from home, symbols of how wide the Viking world had stretched. Their seamanship was extraordinary. They sailed without compasses in the early centuries, guided by sun, stars, and experience. Some sagas suggest they used crystals, sunstones, to find light in cloudy skies. They reached Iceland, Greenland, and even North America long before Columbus, Vinland. They called it a land of grapes and woods. They tried to settle, but did not remain. Perhaps the locals resisted. Perhaps the distance was too great. Their courage carried them farther than most could imagine, even if permanence escaped them. And yet, beneath all of it, raids, trade, exploration, and myth, there was always daily life, planting in spring, harvesting in summer, preserving food for winter, telling sagas by firelight. The rhythm of their lives was simple, but enduring. It carried them across oceans. It bound them to the land. It gave them stories that lasted beyond the end of their age. Picture it. As you rest, a longship gliding over dark water, oars dipping like heartbeat, a hall glowing with torchlight, voices rising in story and song, a winter morning where snow muffles the earth and only the crunch of footsteps disturbs the silence. This was the world of the Vikings, fierce, flawed, enduring, and strangely human. The Viking world was not one people, but many. Each region of Scandinavia had its own leaders, its own traditions, its own ambitions. Some chiefs were little more than strong farmers with loyal households. Others grew into kings who claimed whole coasts as their realm. The sagas speak of early rulers whose names blur into legend. Figures like Harald Fairhair of Norway, who supposedly united the land under one crown. His nickname suggests beauty, though some sources hint he looked more like a haystack left out in the rain. A reminder that poetic flattery was part of the job description. Power among the Vikings was fluid. A man might rise by skill in battle, by wealth in trade, or by charisma at gatherings called things. These were assemblies where disputes were settled, laws declared, and leaders chosen. Imagine hundreds of free men gathered in a field, voices rising and falling as they debated matters of land, inheritance, or insult. It was democracy of a kind, though one occasionally enhanced by sharp swords and quick tempers. Wealth flowed into these communities from abroad. Silver coins from the Abbasid Caliphate have been found buried in Swedish soil. Hoards hidden in fear or in ritual. Some hoards weigh kilograms, evidence that even remote villages were plugged into global exchange. A farmer in Uppsala might plow his field while wearing beads from India, or drink from a cup cast in the Middle East. Trade was not a footnote, it was central. The raids, of course, fed wealth too, and reputation. A successful raid brought treasure, slaves, and fame. Fame mattered deeply, for in a culture where sagas were sung, to be remembered was victory over death. A warrior sought not only silver, but story. He wanted his name carried forward in verse, even if the poet chose to mention that he also tripped over a goat in his youth. Norse honesty could be unforgiving. Raids also reshaped Europe. Coastal villages from Ireland to Spain learned to fear sails on the horizon. Frankish kings scrambled to build fortifications. Alfred the Great in England fought not only with armies, but with fortified towns. The Vikings forced their enemies to adapt, and in doing so, changed the map of Europe. Monasteries were fortified. Trade was reorganized. Kingdoms shifted. A people from the edges had forced the center to take notice. And yet, many Vikings did not remain raiders. They settled. They built farms in fertile lands abroad. They married local women. They carved out small kingdoms. In England, the Danelaw emerged. Regions ruled by Norse law instead of Anglo-Saxon custom. In France, a Viking chief named Rollo was granted Normandy, land for loyalty, a curious bargain that produced descendants who would later conquer England itself. Viking blood was not only spilled on battlefields, it flowed into the veins of future kings. Back home in Scandinavia, farming continued. Families spun wool, wove cloth, carved wood, and raised children. A life of ordinary work, where the heroic sagas coexisted with muddy boots and stubborn cattle. It is easy to forget that the same men who stormed cities abroad spent most of their lives arguing about fences and grazing rights. But perhaps that is what made the sagas so important. They lifted the imagination above chores, reminding listeners that while they fed sheep today, their ancestors had faced giants in myth. The myths themselves reveal much about Viking values. Odin was wise but cunning, a god who won knowledge through sacrifice. Thor was strong but quick to anger, loyal to kin, yet prone to overeating. Loki was clever but treacherous, necessary but dangerous. These gods mirrored human contradictions. They offered no promise of eternal comfort, only examples of courage, endurance in a world that was always slipping towards chaos. Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, was inevitable. In this final battle, even the gods would fall. Thor would kill the serpent, but die from its venom. Odin would be devoured by the wolf Fenrir. The world would burn, and yet, from the ashes, a new one would rise. It is a strange comfort, a vision where destruction and renewal are bound together. Perhaps it reflected the Viking understanding of life, that nothing lasted, but nothing ended without creating something else. When not farming or raiding, Vikings also played games. Board games like Nefatafel, a kind of strategy game where a king tried to escape attackers. Archaeologists have found gaming pieces carved of bone and glass, left in graves as if the dead would need entertainment on their journey. Children played with small carved toys, miniature animals or ships. Life was harsh, but leisure still found a place. Feasts brought communities together, meat roasted over fire, mead poured in abundance, poetry recited in honor of ancestors. Feasts were not only indulgence, they were politics. Leaders gave gifts to secure loyalty. Poets recited to keep their patrons remembered, and warriors sized each other up across the hall. The glow of torches, the smell of smoke, the sound of voices rising together. This was as central to Viking life as the clash of axes. Clothing reflected status, brightly dyed tunics and dresses for those who could afford them, plain wool for others. Jewelry of silver and bronze marked wealth, and sometimes vanity. Archaeologists have even found imported silk in graves, proof that some Vikings returned home determined to look as fashionable as possible, even if their neighbors whispered that silk looked out of place in a hall still full of goats. Weapons were practical, but also symbolic. The sword was costly, often handed down for generations, with names given like family members. An axe or spear was more common. Sturdy tools that could split wood one day and skulls the next. Shields were painted wood, round and versatile, simple but effective. These objects carried meaning beyond battle. They represented identity, pride, and memory. Humor ran through their culture. Saga characters insult one another with a bluntness that feels almost modern. A man might be remembered not for victory, but for a single embarrassing mistake, and that mistake could echo for centuries in verse. Imagine being known forever as the warrior who slipped on seaweed before a duel. The Norse sense of humor was merciless and eternal. But for all their jokes, they believed deeply in honor. A man's reputation was his most valuable possession. Loss of wealth could be repaired. Loss of life was inevitable. But loss of honor was destruction of the self. This is why sagas are so full of feuds, quarrels, and stubborn pride. Better to risk death than to let an insult stand unanswered. And yet, even in this hard world, there were softer edges. Viking art shows intricate carvings of animals and knots, ships adorned with dragons and serpents, jewelry decorated with spirals and beasts. They found beauty in the patterns of the world, weaving it into wood, stone, and metal. Even warriors surrounded themselves with art, proof that ferocity and delicacy can coexist. Their burials tell us much. Chiefs were sometimes laid in ships, surrounded by weapons, tools, and treasures. Sometimes even sacrificed animals or servants were included to accompany them to the next world. Other graves were simpler: a farmer with his tools, a woman with her keys and jewelry. Death mirrored life, practical, symbolic, and always a reminder that the story continued beyond the grave. The archaeological record preserves fragments: a comb here, a bead there, a fragment of cloth preserved in ice. From these small things, we reconstruct lives once vast and complex. A bead carried from the east tells us of trade. A comb tells us of care. A gaming piece tells us of leisure. The sagas give us drama, but archaeology gives us the quiet moments, the texture of daily existence. The Viking story is not only one of fear and fire, but of adaptation, curiosity, and resilience. They were not a single people or a single destiny, but communities bound by ships, stories, and survival. They left behind scars and songs, ruins and roots, traces that still linger in languages, in place names, in legends. When the Vikings turned their gaze west, the islands and shores of Britain and Ireland became both target and opportunity. At first they came as raiders, fast strikes at monasteries and villages, taking silver, cattle, and captives. Their ships vanished before armies could respond. For years the pattern repeated, fear spreading with every sail that appeared on the horizon. The wealth of the monasteries was irresistible. Gold chalices, jeweled covers of manuscripts, sacred relics. To the monks, these were treasures of the faith. To the Vikings, they were convenient items of high resale value. It is a sharp reminder that one man's holy artifact is another man's portable loot. But raiding soon shifted into something else. The coasts of Britain were fertile, the rivers broad, and the climate milder than the long winters of Scandinavia. Many Vikings began to settle, founding small communities along the shores of Ireland, Scotland, and England. Dublin itself was first built as a Viking trading town, a hub of ships and silver. It is easy to forget that what began in fire often ended in foundations. England in particular became a battlefield of cultures. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria struggled against waves of Viking attacks. In 865 came what the chronicles call the Great Heathen Army, a force far larger than any previous raiding band. They landed, marched inland, and seized towns and fortresses. They were no longer content with plunder. They sought rule. Some kings resisted, others fell. Northumbria was crushed, East Anglia overrun. Only Wessex held firm, led by Alfred the Great. Alfred fought battles, built fortified towns, and even constructed a navy of his own to counter Viking ships. His success was uneven, but his persistence kept Wessex alive. In time, a balance was struck, dividing England into regions under Anglo-Saxon law and others under Viking law. This was the Danelaw, where Norse customs shaped daily life. The Danelaw was more than politics. It was cultural exchange. Norse words slipped into English speech. Names of towns ending in by or Thorpe mark Viking settlement. Even farming practices blended. In kitchens and workshops, in marriages and markets, the two peoples mixed. It was not always peaceful, but it was lasting. Ireland too felt their presence. Monasteries fell, but trading towns rose. Dublin, Waterford, Limerick became Viking strongholds. Yet the Irish kingdoms were resilient, raiding and fighting in return. For every Viking fort built, an Irish king was ready to challenge it. The balance swayed back and forth, sometimes brutal, sometimes surprisingly cooperative. Scotland and the Northern Isles became deeply entwined with Norse influence. The Orkneys, Shetlands, and Hebrides turned into Viking bases. From these islands, ships launched raids across the Irish Sea. Families intermarried. Place names shifted. The line between Norse and local blurred. Centuries later, the echoes still remain in dialect and tradition. To the west, Vikings pushed even farther. They crossed the sea to Iceland, a land of volcanoes, glaciers, and endless nights. Settlers built farms on narrow strips of fertile soil, gathering at their own assemblies to settle disputes. Iceland became a unique experiment, without kings, governed instead by laws and by memory. Here the sagas were written down centuries later, preserving the world of the Vikings with unmatched detail. And then came Greenland, harsher still, with farms clinging to fjords where grass barely grew. The settlers endured for generations, hunting seals, herding sheep, trading ivory from walrus tusks. Their world was always precarious, balanced on the edge of climate and isolation. Eventually, the colonies faded, swallowed by ice and silence, leaving only ruins on the shore. But perhaps the boldest voyage was to Vinland, North America. The sagas tell of Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailing west from Greenland. He reached a land of forests, rivers, and wild grapes. They called it Vinland. Here the Norse built small settlements, cutting timber, exploring rivers, meeting native peoples. The encounters were tense, sometimes violent, and the settlers did not last long. Distance and resistance proved too great. The dream of Vinland faded, though memory of it lingered. All of this expansion was possible because of the ships. The longship remains the icon of the Viking Age. Long, narrow, shallow in draft. It could skim across seas or climb shallow rivers. Oars lined the sides. A single sail could drive it swiftly before the wind. Crews slept on deck under the open sky, enduring rain, cold, and spray. Yet these vessels carried them farther than almost anyone before. Navigation relied on skill and patience. The sun, the stars, the flight of birds, the color of water. Some sagas mention sunstones, crystals that revealed the sun's direction even in clouds. Whether myth or truth, it shows how the Vikings thought of their world, a place navigable if one had the courage to trust signs and memory. Life aboard ship was difficult. Men crowded together with little shelter, meals of dried fish or bread, nights of damp clothing and aching muscles. And yet there must have been moments of wonder, a sunrise over an empty horizon, dolphins leaping alongside the hull, the strange silence of a sea with no land in sight. These were experiences only the bold would know. Raiding was violent, but it was also practical. Silver was needed to pay followers, to reward loyalty, to fund feasts and gifts. Without wealth, a leader could not hold men. And so raids were not only chaos, they were politics. The sword and the oar were tools of power as much as the plow and the loom. Still, humor did not vanish from this world. The sagas tell of warriors mocked for foolishness, of kings with embarrassing nicknames. Harold Bluetooth, for example, remembered less for empire and more for a tooth that looked suspiciously rotten. Viking honesty spared no one. Greatness could be celebrated, but pettiness was remembered too. Even leaders who rose high faced limits. Kings who demanded too much risked rebellion. Families who grew too proud were cut down. Viking politics were sharp-edged, but balanced by gatherings at the Thing. Here, free men voiced their rights, challenged leaders, and swore oaths. It was not democracy as we know it, but it was not tyranny either. It was a society in motion, pulled between the strong hand of chiefs and the stubborn pride of farmers. And in their art, we see another side. Wood carved into curling beasts, ships adorned with dragons and serpents, jewelry twisted into knots and spirals. Their designs were fluid, alive with motion, as if even in stillness the world was turning. Perhaps it reflected the sea itself, always shifting, never at rest. Burials continued to mark status. A great chief might be laid in a ship, surrounded by weapons, tools, and treasures. Sometimes even sacrificed animals or companions were placed beside him. The ordinary were buried with simpler goods, but always with care. A comb, a bead, a knife. Reminders that the next life would need the same tools as this one. Archaeology reveals these fragments: a bead from the east, a silver coin from Arabia, a child's toy carved of bone, each item small, yet together they weave a vast tapestry. Proof that the Viking world was not isolated brutality, but rich, connected, and curious. And through it all, the sagas endure. Their words carry the voices of long-dead poets, warriors, farmers, and wanderers. They laugh, they mock, they remember. They carry us into a world both alien and familiar, a world where storms raged, axes fell, And yet people still worried about sheep, soup, and reputation. As Viking raids gave way to settlements, leaders rose who sought to bind scattered families and petty chiefs into larger kingdoms. In Norway, the sagas tell of Harald Fairhair, said to have sworn not to cut or comb his hair until he ruled all the land. It is a grand vow, though one imagines the early years must have left him looking like a hay bale dragged through a storm. Eventually, after battles and bargains, he claimed the crown of a united Norway. Whether every detail is true or not, the legend reflects a hunger for unity in a world often fractured by rivalry. Denmark too grew under ambitious rulers. Kings there turned raiders into armies, building fleets that struck across Europe. From Denmark came Harald Bluetooth, remembered today more for the modern wireless symbol that bears his name than for his kingdom. His nickname hints at a tooth discolored or rotten, an odd legacy for a man who spread Christianity across his land. Even greatness could be reduced to dentistry, proof that history often keeps the strangest details. Christianity itself became a turning point. At first, the Norse clung to their gods, but trade and conquest exposed them to Christian neighbors. Some converted for belief, others for politics. For to be baptized was to secure alliances, to join the growing fabric of European power. Yet conversion did not erase the old stories. Odin, Thor, and Loki lingered in memory, sometimes woven into new tales, sometimes carved quietly on stones alongside crosses. The shift was gradual, uneven, and filled with compromise. England remained a magnet for ambition. After years of raids and the fragile balance of the Danelaw, new leaders sought more. Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark invaded, claiming the crown of England. His reign was short, but his son, Knut the Great, forged a North Sea empire linking Denmark, England, and Norway under one rule. For a brief time, the Viking world reached its greatest political height. Knut is remembered with a curious story. He is said to have sat by the sea, ordering the tide to halt, only to show his courtiers that no king could command the waves. Whether the tale is truth or later invention, it remains a parable of humility. A king with armies and ships could not master the sea itself. The story lingers because it admits what power often forgets, that nature waits for no crown. The Vikings who settled abroad blended with local cultures. In Normandy, Norse settlers became French in language and custom, yet carried their martial skills into the heart of Europe. Their descendants, the Normans, would one day cross the Channel and seize England. William the Conqueror, a descendant of Viking Rollo, triumphed in 1066. It was a strange circle. Norsemen who once raided as pagans now ruled as Christian kings, reshaping the island they had terrorized for centuries. Meanwhile, in the east, Viking traders and warriors pressed along the rivers of Russia. They were called Varangians, moving goods from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Some settled, marrying into Slavic families, founding towns that grew into cities like Novgorod and Kiev. Their influence left marks on language, law, and memory. Though their role is debated, it is certain that Norse blood flowed in the roots of what became Russia and Ukraine. The Varangians also reached Byzantium, the shining capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. There they served as the Varangian Guard, elite bodyguards of the emperors. Towering men with axes stood watch in gilded halls, loyal not to faction but to gold. Imagine the sight. Men from icy fjords guarding a throne beneath mosaics of saints, muttering in Norse about the heat, perhaps unimpressed by the silk robes swirling around them. Their presence was both practical and symbolic. The empire trusted foreigners more than its own scheming nobles. Back in Scandinavia, daily life remained rooted in farms and families. Even kings ruled from halls that were smoky, crowded, and far less glamorous than later palaces. A ruler's strength came not from splendor, but from generosity. To feast his followers, to gift silver, to reward poets. This was the true mark of kingship. A stingy king could not last. His men would drift away to serve someone more generous. Loyalty was measured in meat and mead as much as in promises. Poets played a central role in this system. Skalds composed verses praising their patrons, weaving deeds into sagas that outlasted lifetimes. But skalds could also mock, and their mockery could wound. A clever insult might cling to a man's name for centuries. Nicknames like Bluetooth, Forkbeard, or fair hair reveal both affection and ridicule. It is telling that Viking leaders accepted this, for to silence the poets was worse than to endure them. Memory was currency, and even an embarrassing verse was better than being forgotten. Archaeology supports this image of gift-giving and display. Hoards of silver buried in fields, perhaps hidden in fear, perhaps offerings to the gods. Some contain coins from across the world, dirhams from the Abbasid Caliphate, Frankish deniers, Anglo-Saxon pennies. Imagine a farmer in Sweden tucking away silver that had passed through the hands of merchants in Baghdad. The Viking world was not isolated. It was connected by a web of rivers and seas that tied continents together. The wealth they gathered fueled not only politics but art, intricate carvings in wood and stone, jewelry of interwoven beasts and spirals, ships with dragon heads rising from their prows. The style is distinctive, fluid, alive, as if motion itself had been trapped in line and form. These designs were not only decoration, they were expressions of belief, of identity, and perhaps of the restless energy that drove the people outward. Yet alongside wealth and art lay constant danger, feuds between families, rivalries between chiefs, disputes over land or honor. The sagas are full of such conflicts, often sparked by a single insult or a contested inheritance. A quarrel at a feast could spiral into generations of bloodshed. It seems absurd, and yet to the Norse mind, honor was life itself. To let an insult stand was to diminish forever. Better to risk all than to live shamed. Still, humor softened even this harshness. The saga's relish in pointing out foolishness. A warrior might be mocked for tripping at the wrong moment. A king might be remembered less for victory than for clumsy speech. These stories remind us that even in a culture of violence, laughter had its place. And sometimes the sharpest wound came not from a blade, but from a well-aimed jest. Religion continued to evolve. Temples and sacrifices honored the old gods, but Christian missionaries pressed northward. Kings weighed their choices carefully. Baptism brought alliance, but risked angering those loyal to Odin and Thor. The transition was slow, uneven. Sometimes one ruler converted while his people clung to the old ways. Sometimes a kingdom bent outwardly to the cross while secretly still whispering the names of older gods. It was a patchwork faith, shifting with time. Runestones tell part of this story. Carved stones raised in memory of the dead, they often combined Christian crosses with runic inscriptions. A blend of new and old, families wanted to honor both traditions, unwilling to discard the past, but eager to embrace the future. These stones still stand in fields and churchyards, silent witnesses to a people caught between two worlds. By the late Viking Age, change was everywhere. Raiding grew harder as defenses strengthened. Settlements abroad turned Norsemen into Normans or Russ. Christianity reshaped belief. Kings built firmer states. The age of surprise longships was fading, replaced by armies that looked more like those of Europe. The Viking spirit remained, but the world around them had shifted, and yet, for a time, their impact was undeniable. They reshaped kingdoms, redirected trade, spread language and law. They carried tales from Baghdad to Iceland. They left behind not only ruins, but roots, traces in surnames, in place names, in the bloodlines of Europe's rulers. They were outsiders who became insiders, raiders who became rulers, pagans who became Christians. The end did not come suddenly. It faded slowly. Battles lost, conversions completed, identities blended. By the 12th century, the Viking Age was over, but its echoes remained. The longships no longer prowled the rivers of Europe, but the memory of them never left. Even now, 1,000 years later, the word Viking carries weight. It conjures sails on the horizon, axes raised in halls, laughter around a winter fire, and the stubborn pride of people who refuse to be small in a world that often tried to shrink them. Life among the Vikings was not only raids, kings, and distant journeys. It was also the quiet rhythm of households, the steady work of farming, and the rituals that gave shape to each season. To understand them fully, we must step inside the longhouse, where daily life unfolded in smoky air and flickering firelight. A longhouse was the center of the family, built from timber and turf, its roof sloping low against the weather. Inside, benches lined the walls. Furs and woven blankets offered comfort, and a single hearth burned in the middle. The smoke curled upward through a hole in the roof, never fully escaping. It must have been both warm and choking, cozy and unpleasant, a contradiction that people endured because survival mattered more than comfort. Meals were eaten together, sometimes plain, sometimes plentiful. On ordinary days there was bread of barley or rye, dried fish, or thin stews of vegetables. On good days there might be meat, lamb or beef or pork, smoked and salted for the winter. Skyr, thick and sour, was common. Children grew up on its sharp taste, which likely built both strength and a certain indifference to flavor. In a feast, of course, the story changed. Meat roasted on spits, horns of mead passed hand to hand, and songs carried through the smoky hall. Feasts were political theater. A generous host gained loyalty. A stingy one lost it. A man might forget a battle wound, but he would never forget the taste of a feast denied. Leaders knew this, and kept their halls stocked not only with weapons but with ale and gifts. A silver arm ring might buy more devotion than a speech. A skald's poem might secure memory longer than a monument. The skalds were the poets, masters of verse and memory. Their role was both artist and historian. Their poems praised, but also mocked. A king who tried to silence a poet risked being forgotten, which was worse than insult. Some skalds turned sarcasm into survival, delivering flattery with one hand and barbed humor with the other. One wonders how many rulers smiled through clenched teeth while secretly wishing the poet would choke on his mead. Law and order were kept through assemblies, called things. These were gatherings where free men met to decide disputes, pass judgment, and confirm leaders. They were not simple mobs, but carefully structured meetings, with rules, procedures, and expectations of fairness. Still, the sagas remind us that fairness often bent under the weight of anger or influence. A clever tongue could win as surely as a sharp sword. Punishments were severe. Outlawry was one of the harshest sentences. A man declared outlaw lost all protection of law. Anyone could kill him, and no penalty followed. To be outlawed was to be erased from society, a fate worse than exile. Imagine living in a small world of farms and fjords, then suddenly being untouchable, cut off from every meal, every fire, every shelter. It was a punishment that struck deeper than death. Marriage was both practical and political. Families arranged unions to secure alliances, property, or peace. A wife managed the household, the stores, the livestock, and often the family wealth. Keys found in graves of women are thought to symbolize this authority. She had the power to divorce if her husband failed his duties. Viking women had more rights than many of their contemporaries, and they used them. A man might swing a sword abroad, but at home, he had to answer to the keeper of the keys. Children were raised in this environment of labor and legend. They learned to farm, to spin wool, to carve wood. They also learned the sagas, memorizing stories of gods and heroes. In a way, sagas were textbooks, teaching values of courage, endurance, and wit. A boy might hear of Thor's battles, a girl of Freya's strength, and both would learn that laughter and bravery were weapons against hardship. Religion touched all parts of life. Sacrifices were made at seasonal festivals. Animals offered to the gods. Feasts shared in their honor. The great temple at Uppsala was described by later writers as filled with gold and images of gods. Though whether every detail is true is uncertain, what is certain is that ritual mattered to mark harvest and sowing, birth and death, war and peace. Conversion to Christianity spread unevenly. In some places, kings embraced the new faith quickly. In others, the old gods lingered stubbornly. Often the two blended. A cross carved on a rune stone might stand beside runes invoking Thor. Families hedged their bets, honoring both Christ and Odin, until one belief slowly edged the other aside. It was less a clean break than a slow weaving of traditions. Humor remained ever present. One saga tells of a man mocked because his beard was too thin, another of a warrior whose horse stumbled at the wrong moment, turning his proud charge into comedy. Even at funerals, poets sometimes slipped a joke into remembrance. Perhaps it was their way of admitting that death itself could be mocked, if only for a moment. The Viking world was filled with contradictions. Warriors who were also farmers, poets who were also fighters, pagans who slowly became Christians. They were practical, but also superstitious, brutal in raids, but deeply attached to families. The sagas do not hide these contradictions. They celebrate them, as if to say that people are never only one thing, but always many. Travel brought them new experiences. A Viking merchant in Constantinople might return home describing spices that burned the tongue, fabrics smoother than anything woven in the north, coins stamped with strange writing. Imagine the reaction of neighbors hearing such tales, half believing, half doubting, wondering if their friend had been dazzled by foreign wonders or tricked by clever traders. Coins themselves became markers of wealth and memory. Thousands of Arabic dirhams have been found buried in Scandinavian soil, likely the savings of traders and raiders alike. Some hoards were offerings to the gods, silver hidden in the earth as thanks or plea. Others were buried in haste and never reclaimed. Perhaps the owner fell abroad or simply forgot where the treasure lay, a mistake that must have haunted his descendants when they needed silver most. These discoveries remind us that the Vikings were not isolated barbarians, but part of a network that stretched across continents, from Baghdad to Byzantium, from Greenland to Ireland. Their ships carried goods, people, and ideas. The north was cold and distant, but it was never cut off. Still, the image of the raider endured, a sudden strike at dawn, flames rising, shouts echoing through a monastery. For the victims, this was the truth that mattered. Yet for the raiders, it was a single act among years of farming, trading, and storytelling. The duality is uncomfortable, but real. As you imagine their world, you can picture both scenes. A quiet hall at night, family gathered, a storyteller weaving the saga of Odin's search for wisdom. And then, months later, those same men rowing a ship up the Thames, axes ready, eyes fixed on wealth ahead, two realities of one people, shifting like the sea itself. The sagas were the great treasure of the Viking world. They were not written down at first, but spoken, sung, and remembered. Words carried across fire-lit halls, repeated until they were etched not in ink but in memory. A saga was more than a story. It was a thread binding families to ancestors, communities to values, and the living to the dead. Some sagas told of gods, vast and flawed, locked in struggles against giants or against one another. Others told of men and women, of feuds and voyages, of pride and loss. To hear them was to be reminded that courage mattered, that wit could save as surely as a sword, and that fate was always waiting, no matter how clever or strong a person might be. Sagas were recited in long cadences, with patterns and kennings. Those kennings were poetic riddles, calling a ship the swan of the sea, or gold the fire of the serpent. It gave language a shimmer, turning ordinary things into puzzles of meaning. For the listeners, it was a game and a guide, a way to see the world in layers. Not all listeners enjoyed them equally. Children, no doubt, grew restless, shifting on benches while elders nodded with solemn approval. One imagines a boy secretly wishing the storyteller would hurry so supper might begin, only to find his own children yawning years later as he tried to recite the same lines. Tradition was as stubborn as winter. The humor of the sagas carried its own bite. A hero could be praised for bravery in one verse, then mocked for slipping on seaweed in the next. Nicknames were merciless. A man might be called the bold, but also the crooked nose, the fat, or the lousy. The poets did not flatter without limit. Perhaps that is why the sagas ring true. They carried honesty sharpened by wit, myth spilled into daily life. When thunder rolled across the fjord, it was Thor striking his hammer. When a raven circled overhead, it was Odin's bird, watching. When mischief seemed to unravel plans, Loki's name might be muttered, not in prayer, but in resignation. The gods were not distant. They were companions, sometimes helpful, sometimes inconvenient. Sacrifices honored them. Animals were offered at festivals, blood sprinkled on stones and wood, meat roasted and shared among the people. It was both worship and community, a reminder that survival was not only individual, but collective. To feed the gods was also to feed one another. Christianity brought disruption. Priests told of one God, jealous and eternal. But for a people used to many gods, each flawed and familiar, this was a difficult shift. To abandon Thor's hammer, to stop whispering to Odin, felt like cutting loose old friends. Many resisted, others blended. A man might wear a cross on his chest, but carve Thor's hammer on his door, just in case. This overlap lingered for generations. Archaeologists have found stones with both crosses and runes, graves with Christian prayers alongside pagan amulets. A society does not change in a season. It drifts, like a ship turning slowly on the tide. Runes themselves carried mystery. Each sign was letter and symbol, word, and charm. They were carved on wood, stone, bone, sometimes simply as writing, other times as magic. A runestone might proclaim a man's name, his deeds, his family, but it might also be raised for protection, to hold memory, or to call unseen powers. To carve was to claim both space and time. The thing assemblies also used memory as law. Disputes were settled not with books, but with voices. Men recalled precedents, quoted sagas, or cited past judgments. Memory itself was the archive. If one forgot, one lost. It is little wonder that storytelling was prized, for to speak well was to wield power. Even games and leisure reflected their world. Nefertafel, the board game of kings, echoed their politics. A central king surrounded by defenders, attackers pressing in from every side, a strategy match that could mirror a siege. Children played with carved animals and ships, mimicking the lives they would soon inherit. Even in play, they rehearsed survival. Music too carried through their lives. Harps, flutes, simple drums, songs sung at feasts, chants on ships, perhaps a rower humming to steady the rhythm of oars, or a woman singing softly while spinning wool. Fragments of this music survive only in imagination, but one can picture its cadence, slow, steady, comforting. The feasts themselves were stages of memory. A man who hosted well was remembered well. Gifts were given, verses recited, stories told. The poor host risked mockery, which could last generations. Imagine the embarrassment of being known not for courage or conquest, but for serving thin ale at a feast. In a world of sagas, reputation was everything. Death too became part of memory. A fallen warrior might be praised in verse, his deeds sung into the ears of children. A chieftain buried in a ship, his weapons and treasures beside him, ensured that his story remained visible in the earth itself. Memory was their immortality. For in a harsh world, few sought eternity, but all sought remembrance. Even outlawry became memory. To be cast out was to be forgotten. To have no name in verse, no stone raised in your honor, was to vanish utterly. It was the cruelest fate, proof that in Norse eyes, erasure was worse than death. The sagas also reveal everyday concerns, quarrels over grazing, insults at feasts, debates at assemblies. These stories sit beside tales of dragons and giants, giving the impression that the extraordinary and the ordinary were never far apart. One moment Thor slays a serpent, the next a farmer complains about fences. Life and myth were woven without seam. We can imagine a winter night in Iceland, snow pressing on the roof, the fire glowing, a poet reciting the story of Sigurd slaying the dragon, as goats shuffle in the shadows, the listeners nodding slowly, some lost in the wonder of legend. others thinking more about whether the goats will survive until spring. The line between survival and story was never clear. Humor again slips in here. A saga might devote a page to insults about beards, or recount a marriage proposal that went wrong in spectacular fashion. In one tale, a warrior is mocked for swimming poorly, proof that even courage could be undercut by poor technique. These asides keep the tales alive, humanizing heroes and reminding listeners that perfection was never expected. And in this humor, there was relief. Life was hard, winters long, fields thin, raids uncertain. To laugh was survival. A jest could carry the same weight as bread, easing the heaviness of existence. The Vikings measured time not in calendars, but in seasons, sowing and harvest, light and dark. Their days followed the sun, their years followed the turn of the soil, yet their memory stretched across centuries, anchored in stories, names, and stones. They lived with the awareness that fate pressed on all, and so they carved meaning wherever they could. So the sagas endure, not as fantasies, but as windows into a people who knew both hardship and joy, who mocked and praised, who feared and laughed. They are echoes of fires long extinguished, words that refuse to vanish, voices that still travel across time, steady as oars on water, carrying us deeper into their world. Power among the Vikings was never simple. A king could rise quickly, but he could also fall just as fast, for loyalty was not guaranteed by birth alone. It had to be earned through gifts, generosity, and success. Men followed leaders who could reward them, who could feed them at feasts, and who could bring them silver after raids. Without wealth, a leader was just another man in a smoky hall. Feasts were the great display of power. A chieftain seated at the high bench. His followers ranged around the fire, horns of mead passing from hand to hand, meat roasted and carved, poets reciting the deeds of their patron. Every mouthful of food, every gift of silver or jewelry was an investment in loyalty. To be remembered as generous was to be remembered as strong. To be called stingy was a slow death of reputation. The sagas tell of leaders mocked for failing at this duty. One chieftain was ridiculed because his feast had too little meat, another because the ale was weak. The insult endured long after the food was forgotten. In some ways, a ruler's kitchen was as important as his armory. Both provided survival, one through battle, the other through loyalty. Feuds filled this world. An insult at a feast could spark generations of bloodshed. A quarrel over land might draw entire families into conflict. The sagas are filled with stories where one sharp word cuts as deep as any sword. Honor demanded response. Silence was weakness, for in a society where memory was immortality, to be seen as cowardly was to vanish before your time. These feuds were sometimes absurd. One tale tells of men fighting over a sheep, another over the right to sit closest to the fire. Yet the consequences were real. Blood spilled, families divided, lands abandoned. The lesson is sobering, for what seems small in one world may be enormous in another. When survival is fragile, pride becomes heavy. Law was meant to restrain this chaos. The thing assemblies gathered to settle disputes. Law speakers recited precedents from memory. Elders argued and judged. In theory, it was fairness. In practice, it was politics. A clever tongue could twist truth. A powerful man could sway opinion. Yet even so, the thing gave ordinary men a voice. It was not equality, but it was participation. And it gave Norse society a rhythm beyond the sword. Outlawry remained the ultimate punishment. To strip a man of legal protection was to strip him of humanity. No one could shelter him. No one could feed him. To help an outlaw was to risk becoming one yourself. Imagine living in a small valley where every farm is known and suddenly finding yourself invisible, alive, but untouchable. Death might have seemed kinder. Kingship itself was fragile. A ruler's power was checked not only by rivals, but by his own followers. A king who pressed too hard risked rebellion. One who gave too little risked desertion. The sagas record kings mocked as fools, or even overthrown when they proved incompetent. Authority was conditional, negotiated daily. Nicknames reveal much about these rulers. Harold Fairhair, Swain Forkbeard, Harold Bluetooth. Even the great Knut was remembered with stories of tides and humility. Sometimes these names were flattering, other times embarrassing. They clung to memory like burrs, for the Norse were unwilling to let even kings escape mockery. A crooked nose, a strange tooth, a foolish act, all could become immortalized in verse. In some regions, the old and new coexisted for generations. A farmer might whisper a prayer to Christ, then hang Thor's hammer above his door, just to be safe. It was not hypocrisy. It was pragmatism. When survival depends on harvest and weather, one does not risk offending either heaven or Asgard. The poets captured this tension. Some verses praise Christ as King of Heaven. Others call on Odin's wisdom. Occasionally the two appear side by side, as if even the poets were unwilling to choose. Their words show us a society in transition, not a clean break, but a slow blending. Power was also displayed in death. A wealthy chief might be buried in a ship, surrounded by weapons, animals, and treasures. Fire or earth claimed the vessel, but its memory endured in story. A simpler farmer might have only tools and beads, yet even that burial spoke of care. For to die forgotten was the true fear. To die remembered was victory. Ship burials remain among the most striking finds. Great vessels hauled ashore, filled with goods and bodies, then covered with mounds of earth. Archaeologists uncover them centuries later. Wood rotted away, but iron rivets still in place. Patterns of planks preserved in soil. These graves are echoes of power, frozen in the earth. Rituals of death also reflected humor. Some sagas mention mocking words spoken even at funerals, a reminder that death did not silence wit. Perhaps it was a way of keeping balance, admitting that even the mighty could be laughed at in the end, for laughter was not disrespect, but equality before fate. Art carried political weight too. Rune stones raised in honor of ancestors were visible signs of loyalty. A man remembered his kin not only in private but in public stone. Some inscriptions boast of voyages, battles, or Christian faith. Others simply name the dead. A world without paper relied on stone to speak across centuries. Each carving was both monument and message. Even trade became part of politics. A king who controlled a harbor controlled silver. A chief who secured routes to the east secured power. This was not raiding alone, it was strategy. To rule was to master both ores and markets. For silver was not only wealth, it was survival. It fed men, built ships, and secured poets. At times, rivalries spiraled into great battles, fleets clashing on the sea, armies meeting in fields. The sagas recall blood and thunder, yet also blunders and chance. A great leader might win one day and fall the next. Victory was never permanent. It was only borrowed until another man claimed it. And so the Viking Age rolled forward, pulled between farmers and raiders, pagans and Christians, poets and kings, each thread twisting with the others, never fully resolved, always in motion. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it still, the echo of voices in assembly fields, the clash of oars in fjords, the laughter at a feast where insults cut sharper than swords. The Viking world was fragile, fierce, and fleeting. Yet it carried a power that reshaped the edges of Europe. The Viking presence in Europe left marks that never faded. In England, their legacy shaped language, law, and even bloodlines. In Normandy, they transformed from raiders into dukes. In the east, they blended with Slavs, founding dynasties that would become central to later kingdoms. They began as outsiders, feared and hated, yet within a few generations they were rulers, insiders, and builders of states. England carried the deepest scars. Raids had begun with terror, but settlements grew into permanence. Villages in the Danelaw bore names with Norse endings: by, Thorpe, Thwaite. Language itself absorbed their words. Sky, egg, window, husband and law are also Norse gifts. Imagine the confusion of an English farmer learning that the very man raiding his cattle one year might be his son-in-law the next. It was violence, but it was also merging. This merging could be practical. A Norse settler might marry a local woman, take land, and swear loyalty to a local king. The children of such unions grew up speaking two tongues, carrying two cultures in their blood. A generation later, they might identify as English, yet still carve runes on stones in memory of their ancestors. Culture was fluid, memory stubborn. In Normandy, the transformation was even sharper. Rollo the Viking chieftain received land from the French king Charles the Simple. Land in exchange for loyalty. It was a gamble, but it worked. Within a few generations, the Normans spoke French, followed French customs, but retained Norse ambition. They built castles, organized armies, and eventually crossed the Channel to conquer England itself. William the Conqueror in 1066 was the descendant of Rollo, a reminder that raiders had become rulers. The irony is clear. The same people who once burned monasteries in England now built cathedrals as kings. The line between barbarian and builder was thin, blurred by time. One could almost imagine a Viking ancestor watching his descendant and muttering, "Nice church. But where's the loot?" To the east, the Varangians followed rivers into the heart of Russia. Their role remains debated, but they appear in the founding of Novgorod and Kiev. Names of rulers like Rurik suggest Norse origins. They became the Rus, a people blending Norse and Slavic blood. Their descendants would shape the early history of Russia and Ukraine. Vikings who once carried axes across rivers now carried crowns across steppes. The Varangian Guard in Constantinople added another layer. These warriors served Byzantine emperors faithfully, wielding massive axes in defense of thrones surrounded by intrigue. They were chosen for loyalty, precisely because they were foreigners with no ties to local politics. Imagine a Norseman in silk halls, guarding mosaics and marble, muttering in Norse about the heat while watching emperors plot. A man who once raided for silver now earned it by keeping watch. History has a way of turning raiders into guards. Back in Scandinavia, the influence of Europe grew stronger. Christianity spread, slowly but steadily. Kings saw it as a tool of unity. Missionaries brought new rituals. Churches rose where temples once stood. Old gods lingered in memory, in whispered stories, in amulets worn beside crosses, but their hold weakened. Thor's hammer still appeared on stones, yet beside it the cross claimed more space. It was less conquest than gradual exchange, one symbol slipping into another. This transformation also reshaped law. As Christianity took root, written codes began to appear. Law once carried by memory and word now found ink and parchment. Assemblies still mattered, but the church added its own weight. Bishops advised kings. Priests spread doctrine. The old ways bent, and in bending, they changed forever. The sagas preserve this tension. Some tell of kings converting, others of stubborn farmers resisting. In one tale, a man mocks the new faith while clinging to Thor's hammer, only to accept baptism later when it brought him more silver. Faith and politics were intertwined, belief and convenience dancing together. Humor carried through this shift as well. One saga tells of a missionary mocked because he slipped in mud while preaching, another of a farmer who accepted baptism 3 times, hoping to collect gifts from each sponsor. These stories remind us that conversion was not only solemn, it was practical, and sometimes ridiculous. As Europe grew stronger, raids grew harder. Fortified towns lined coasts and rivers. Armies drilled. Kings coordinated defense. The shock that had once made Viking sails terrifying faded as locals learned to fight back. What once was easy plunder now demanded real war. Many chose instead to settle, to trade, to merge. The Viking Age of sudden raids was fading, replaced by integration, but the image of the Viking raider endured in memory. To a monk whose monastery had burned, it was the defining trauma of his life. To a poet in Scandinavia, it was a glorious tale. To later generations, it became legend. Half truth, half myth. The reality was more complicated. Farmers who raided occasionally, traders who carried goods, settlers who married neighbors. They were many things at once. Even daily life reflected change. Houses grew more complex, farms expanded, crafts improved. Trade became more systematic. The North was no longer a wild frontier, but part of the European fabric. Yet in remote valleys, echoes of the old ways lingered, men carving runes into sticks, women whispering charms against illness, gods remembered long after their temples were gone. Archaeology reveals this blend. Churches built beside burial mounds, crosses carved into old stones, silver hoards buried with Christian coins and pagan amulets together. The people did not simply abandon one world for another. They carried both, until slowly, one outweighed the other. This slow shift gave birth to irony. For centuries, Vikings had raided churches, burning and looting. Yet within a few generations, they built their own, carved their own crosses, and prayed at their own altars. The wheel had turned, as it always does. Memory of the old gods lingered longest in the sagas. Odin's hunger for wisdom, Thor's booming strength, Loki's restless tricks. These stories were not erased. They became literature, preserved by Christian scribes who saw them as heritage rather than heresy. Strange to think that monks who once cursed the raiders ended up preserving their myths. Perhaps this was the greatest survival of all. Not silver, not weapons, not ships, but stories. Stories told around fires, whispered in fields, carved into stone. They endure still, reminding us of a world that refused to vanish. The humor of that world is still sharp. A warrior mocked for clumsy swimming. A king forever remembered for a bad tooth. A farmer praised more for his sheep than his courage. These details live on because they are human. In every age, people laughed, even at themselves, even at kings. So the Viking Age bent slowly into Europe's Middle Ages. its sails furled, its axes sheathed, its gods fading into memory, yet its echoes remain in language, in place names, in the stubborn honesty of sagas, and in the quiet reminder that no culture is only one thing, but many things at once. By the later centuries of the Viking Age, the tide was beginning to turn. The shock of their first raids had long passed. Europe had learned. Kings had built fortresses. Villages had organized defenses. Rivers that once lay open now bristled with watchtowers. The Viking longships still inspired fear, but no longer surprise. In England, the balance shifted steadily. Alfred the Great had laid foundations of resistance. His descendants pressed the advantage. Wessex expanded, and one by one the Viking kingdoms of the Danelaw were absorbed. There were still battles, but the momentum had changed. The Norse were no longer feared strangers. They were neighbors, sometimes allies, sometimes enemies, often both at once. Yet Viking ambition did not vanish. In the early 11th century, Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark claimed the English throne. His son, Knut the Great, went further, ruling Denmark, Norway, and England together. For a brief shining moment, the North Sea was a Viking lake, with one king commanding its shores. Knut's reign is remembered as both strong and strange. He was praised for generosity, for justice, and for balancing cultures. Yet he is also remembered for the story of the tide, the tale where he sat upon the shore commanding the sea to retreat. Whether it happened or not is less important than what it symbolized. A reminder that even the greatest king could not master the sea. Power might command men, but it could never command nature. After Knut, the unity collapsed. His sons proved weaker. Rivals rose, and England slipped back into Anglo-Saxon hands. The Norse dream of ruling Britain faded, though the memory of it lingered in sagas and stones. In Ireland, Viking power was also challenged. The towns they had founded, Dublin, Waterford, Limerick, became prizes fought over by Irish kings. One of the most famous clashes came at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, where Irish forces under Brian Boru faced Norse armies. The battle was vast and bloody. Brian himself was killed. The Irish claimed victory, but both sides suffered deeply. The sagas remember Clontarf with drama, half history, half legend. Scotland too resisted. The Norse held the Northern Isles, Orkney, Shetland, and the Hebrides. But on the mainland their influence waned. Local kings and chiefs pushed back, sometimes with swords, sometimes with marriages, always with the stubbornness of people unwilling to vanish. Even across the seas, in Iceland and Greenland, challenges mounted. Iceland thrived as a society of laws and sagas. But even there, disputes could spiral into violence. In Greenland, the colonies clung to survival on the edge of the world, farming in thin soil, hunting seals, trading ivory. For centuries they endured, but slowly the climate grew harsher, trade routes faltered, and the settlements dwindled. By the 15th century, they were gone, leaving behind ruins that whisper of stubborn hope. Vinland, the brief settlement in North America, faded even faster. Encounters with native peoples proved hostile, the distance too great, the challenges too many. It is a haunting thought that centuries before Columbus, ships from Greenland touched American shores, only to vanish back into the sea of memory. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia itself, kings grew stronger, centralizing power, organizing armies, building churches. The wild raids of earlier centuries gave way to structured states. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden began to resemble their medieval forms. Kings still fought, but their wars were less about plunder abroad and more about power at home. Christianity played its part in this shift. The church brought not only new rituals but new order. Written laws replaced spoken memory. Bishops guided kings. Priests kept records. The gods of old still lingered in quiet places, but their hold was broken. Odin's ravens no longer flew over battles. Thor's hammer no longer protected homes. The cross had taken root, and with it came Europe's embrace. Still, the sagas refused to let the old gods vanish. They preserved Odin's wisdom, Thor's strength, Loki's mischief, Ragnarok's doom. Even as Christianity reshaped the North, memory refused to surrender. The stories were no longer worship, but they were heritage, and monks themselves wrote them down, perhaps shaking their heads at tales of giants and serpents, yet still preserving them for us today. The last Viking raids were fierce, but they were exceptions, not the rule. Fleets struck England, raiders struck the Mediterranean, but each campaign ended in defeat or in assimilation. By the 12th century, the Viking Age was done, not with a sudden end, but with a slow fading, like a fire that burns down to embers. And yet, their humor never vanished from memory. Kings remembered for rotten teeth. Warriors mocked for clumsy swimming. Feasts ridiculed for weak ale. It is telling that while historians record victories, the sagas record insults. Perhaps the Norse understood that to be laughed at was its own kind of immortality. For if people still joked about you centuries later, then you were still alive in memory. Archaeology helps us trace this fading age. Hordes buried in fear, never recovered, tell of raids and danger. Churches rising beside old temples tell of transition. Graves with both crosses and Thor's hammers tell of compromise. A people caught between two worlds, neither fully one nor fully the other. The decline of Viking raids does not mean the decline of Norse culture. Instead, it evolved. The Normans in France carried Norse ambition into castles and cavalry. The Rus in the east built states that would last for centuries. In Iceland, the sagas were written down, preserving memory in ink, even as Europe moved on. The Viking Age ended, but the Norse spirit stretched far beyond it. The myths, too, took on new life. Ragnarok became not prophecy, but poetry, a vision of the end that spoke to the fragility of all things. Odin's sacrifice for wisdom remained a parable. Thor's hammer still echoed in storms. Loki's mischief still explained the small absurdities of life. These stories lived on, not in temples, but in minds. It is strange to think that a people who once terrified Europe with fire and steel are now remembered as much for their stories and humor as for their raids. But perhaps that is fitting, for stories last longer than silver. Humor lingers longer than fear. The last great Viking kings fought to hold what their ancestors had won, but time moved against them. Europe grew stronger, borders firmer, faith more unified. The longship gave way to castles, to knights, to armies that could not be surprised by sudden sails. The age of raids was over. The age of kingdoms had begun. By the final centuries of the Viking Age, change pressed in from all sides. The longships that once cut like blades across seas now seemed less invincible, for kings of England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire had learned their lessons. Villages fortified their coasts, monasteries built stone towers, armies stood ready to defend. The raids that once struck like lightning now met with resistance. The Norse still fought fiercely. They still sailed. They still dreamed of silver and glory. But each campaign cost more, brought fewer rewards. A raid into the Mediterranean might seize treasure, yet half the fleet could be lost to storms or to enemies ready with fire ships. Even the bravest warrior eventually noticed when the risks outweighed the rewards. England was the great prize, yet it also became the great test. After the brief North Sea Empire of Knut collapsed, the English crown shifted back to Anglo-Saxon hands. The Norse still dreamed of return. In 1066, Harald Hardrada of Norway made his bid, landing with a great army to claim the throne. He fought at Stamford Bridge and fell there, ending not only his life but the last great Viking attempt to seize England. The sagas tell his story with drama, calling him bold, fierce, unyielding. Yet they also note that his ambition overreached, that his fall was as swift as it was certain. The irony is that his death came only weeks before William the Conqueror crossed the Channel from Normandy. William too was of Viking blood, descended from Rollo, but he did not come as a raider. He came as a duke with cavalry, castles, and papal blessing. The transformation was complete. The Viking raider had become the Norman king. In Ireland, the Viking towns remained: Dublin, Waterford, Limerick. But they were no longer purely Norse. They had blended with Irish life, traded with Irish kings, and become hubs of mixed culture. By the 12th century, even these towns were absorbed by greater powers. Their Norse identity faded into Irish memory. In Scotland and the Isles, the Norse presence lingered longer. The Orkneys, Shetlands, Hebrides all remained tied to Norway well into the Middle Ages. Their culture mixed, their rulers sometimes half Norse and half Gaelic, their stories full of both gods and saints. Even today, echoes of that mix remain. Place names, traditions, dialects that carry whispers of longships and halls. But at the heart of Scandinavia itself, the shift was unavoidable. Kings grew stronger, Christianity rooted deeper, churches rose in stone, markets flourished, armies became professional. The old rhythms of raid and feast gave way to the new rhythms of court and tax. A Viking farmer might now owe his king grain or coin, instead of joining him on a raid abroad. It must have seemed strange to trade the promise of silver in England for the certainty of paying tax at home. Religion marked perhaps the sharpest change. The hammer of Thor once hung from necks across the north, carved on wood, etched on stones. Yet by the 12th century, the cross had become the dominant symbol. Churches stood in villages, bells rang out across fjords, priests replaced skalds as keepers of memory. Still, in sagas, the old gods refused to die. Odin's wisdom, Thor's thunder, Loki's mischief, all survived in words, even when no one sacrificed goats at their altars anymore. The blending could be awkward. One saga recalls a Christian farmer who still muttered oaths to Thor when angry. Another of a man baptized 3 times, mostly for the feasting that followed each ceremony. It was faith, but it was also practicality, a reminder that humans rarely shift in neat straight lines. Law also shifted. Where once law speakers recited memory at assemblies, now codes were written down. Christianity demanded record, permanence, authority beyond the voice of a single man. This changed how disputes unfolded. Memory gave way to parchment, arguments to documents. Perhaps some elders complained that young men trusted ink more than memory, as if trust in paper could replace trust in ancestors. But slowly, writing won. Even art shifted. Norse designs of dragons and knots now mingled with crosses and saints. Wooden churches in Norway rose with steep roofs. Carved beams decorated with serpents and beasts that seemed halfway between pagan and Christian. These stave churches remain as monuments to the transition, where one could step inside and feel both the echo of sagas and the weight of scripture. The sagas themselves were finally written down. In Iceland, poets and scribes recorded the stories that had once been only spoken. They preserved the lives of heroes, the wit of poets, the follies of kings. They wrote of gods already fading, and of warriors already gone. It is one of history's great ironies that Christian scribes preserved pagan myths, keeping alive the very world their faith had replaced. And here the humor remains sharp. A warrior still mocked for swimming badly. A king remembered more for his teeth than his crown. A farmer ridiculed for poor ale at a feast. Perhaps the scribes smiled as they copied, realizing that memory can be cruel, but also honest. For the Norse did not fear laughter. They accepted it as part of their immortality. The decline of Viking raids did not mean the decline of their spirit. Their descendants thrived as Normans, as Russ, as Icelandic poets. They left marks on England's law, France's castles, Russia's thrones. They carved their presence into place names and into memory. The Viking Age ended, but its people did not vanish. They simply changed shape. Archaeology shows us this fading age, hordes buried and forgotten, churches rising beside pagan mounds, runestones carved with crosses, silver coins from Arabia lying in Scandinavian soil, alongside Christian relics. The fragments reveal a people in transition, 1 foot in the old world, 1 foot in the new. The myths too shifted. Once lived as belief, they became instead stories. Odin's ravens no longer flew overhead, but they perched in sagas. Thor's hammer no longer protected homes, but it still struck in verses. Loki no longer ruined lives, but he still caused laughter. The gods of the Norse lived on not in worship, but in memory. And so the Viking Age closed, not with a single battle or moment, but with a slow fading, like a fire dimming into ash. The sails furled, the oars rested, the longships pulled onto land for the last time. The world had changed, and the Vikings had changed with it. Yet, even in their end, they endured. In language, in law, in legend, and in humor most of all. For what other people could terrify half of Europe, and yet be remembered also for their bad teeth, their clumsy swimming, and their love of bathing far more often than their neighbors. Perhaps that is their truest immortality, not fear, but humanity. By the time the 12th century dawned, the Viking Age was no longer what it had been. The sails still rose on northern seas, but their meaning had changed. They carried merchants, pilgrims, fishermen, kings' envoys, less often raiders seeking plunder. The longship was still swift and beautiful, but it was now a vessel of commerce more than chaos. Kings in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden had grown into true monarchs. They levied taxes, built castles, organized courts. Their reach extended further into daily life. No longer did every farmer owe service only when he chose. Now obligations were written, expected, and enforced. The wild independence of earlier centuries gave way to something more structured. For some, it must have felt like stability. For others, like a loss. Christianity spread through every corner. The hammer of Thor gave way to the cross. Churches rose where temples once stood. Priests recorded births, marriages, and deaths. The sagas that had been spoken for generations were finally written down by Christian scribes. preserving the old stories even as the old faith faded. It is one of history's small ironies that monks who once feared Norse raiders now carefully copied their myths into vellum, saving Odin and Thor from oblivion. The sagas themselves carry the contradictions of the people. They praise courage, but mock foolishness. They celebrate generosity, but also laugh at stinginess. They elevate kings, but refuse to hide their flaws. A ruler might be remembered for great battles, but also for a tooth, a limp, or a stumble. The Norse believed immortality came through memory, and memory did not play favorites. This honesty makes the sagas deeply human. We hear of great feasts, and of feasts where the ale was too thin. We hear of warriors brave in battle, yet mocked for poor swimming. We hear of women wise and cunning, holding farms together while men stumbled abroad. These stories remind us that life was not all glory. It was also pettiness, laughter, embarrassment, and endurance. Archaeology confirms this blend of ordinary and extraordinary. A hoard of silver hidden in soil speaks of fear or of devotion. A child's carved toy speaks of play. A broken comb speaks of vanity, even in harsh times. These fragments remind us that people lived not only for raids or gods, but for the daily rhythm of life. They worried about bread, about firewood, about quarrels with neighbors. They laughed. They argued. They grew old. As Europe absorbed them, the Norse left behind roots in language and law. Words like sky, window, and husband are still spoken daily. Place names from Yorkshire to Normandy carry Norse syllables, reminding us of settlers who once built farms there. The shape of law in England bore Norse influence, from assemblies to certain customs. Their impact did not vanish, it blended. In the East, their legacy lingered too. The Rus, born of Norse and Slavic mingling, grew into kingdoms that became central to Eastern Europe. The Byzantine emperors relied on Varangian guards for centuries. Those tall men with axes, foreigners with fierce loyalty, remained symbols of the northern presence in the greatest city of its time. But at home in Scandinavia, something else was taking hold. Kings sought to be like other monarchs of Europe. They built cathedrals, minted coins, corresponded with popes and emperors. Their courts echoed with Latin as well as Norse. Their armies marched with cavalry and banners instead of only oars and shields. The Viking world was dissolving into the medieval one. This did not erase their humor. The sagas still delighted in insults, still remembered kings by their flaws, still mocked men who fell awkwardly at feasts. Perhaps that humor itself was their truest inheritance. The last echoes of their gods lingered in folklore. Farmers whispered charms against illness. Sailors muttered names to the sea. But the rituals had shifted. No more sacrifices at great temples. No more public feasts in honor of Thor or Freya. Instead, quiet echoes in fields and fjords, fading into story. Yet through the sagas those gods endured. Odin still wandered, Thor still struck, Loki still schemed, Ragnarok still loomed, not as a prophecy now, but as poetry, reminding listeners that all things end and all things renew. The Norse had lived with that knowledge, and they left it for us. It is tempting to see the Viking Age as all blood and fire, but the truth is more balanced. It was farming, fishing, feasting, story, laughter, and stubborn survival, as much as it was raiding and ruling. To flatten it to only terror is to miss its depth. To romanticize it only as glory is to miss its humor. The sagas refuse to let us forget either. Picture for a moment a hall in Iceland, the wind howling outside, snow pressing against the roof. Inside, the fire burns, families gathered close. A skald recites a tale of Sigurd slaying a dragon. A child yawns, another giggles, an elder nods with solemn memory. It is history, myth, entertainment, and lesson, all at once. That was the true fabric of the Viking world, woven together with smoke and laughter. By the 12th century, the raids were gone, but the memory was strong. For Europe, the word Viking meant terror. For the descendants of those raiders, it meant pride. Both truths could stand side by side. Memory has never needed to choose only one. And so the Viking Age narrowed. Its sails lowered, its axes sheathed, its longhouses gave way to stone churches, its poets gave way to priests. Yet still the sagas carried their voices forward. Still the humor cut through the centuries. Still the gods whispered in stories even when no one prayed to them. The Viking Age faded not with thunder, but with quiet, not with a single battle, but with a long drift into change. Their ships still sailed, but they carried merchants instead of raiders, pilgrims instead of plunderers. Kings still ruled, but they held their power with parchment and coin as much as with sword and shield. The gods still lived in memory, but their temples were gone, their altars silent. To live in the north by the 12th century was not to be a Viking, but to be a farmer, a craftsman, a subject of a Christian king. A boy who might once have dreamed of raiding England now dreamed of serving in a court or studying with a priest. The longship was no longer the heartbeat of a family. The church bell had taken its place, yet memory is stubborn. Stories lingered in sagas, carved in stone, whispered by firesides. A grandfather might still tell of Odin's ravens, even as his grandson was baptized. A farmer might still mutter Thor's name when thunder rolled across his fields, even while tithing to a church. The old ways slipped away, but they never vanished. Humor carried them too. The sagas delighted in remembering flaws, in mocking kings for rotten teeth, in laughing at warriors who tripped on seaweed. The people who once terrified Europe left behind not only fear, but jokes. Perhaps that was their greatest victory. For laughter outlives terror. Think of the names that survive. Harold Bluetooth, remembered less for his power and more for a discolored tooth. Sweyn Forkbeard, whose beard became his monument. Knut the Great, forever linked to the tide he could not command. These men ruled kingdoms, led armies, shaped centuries. Yet what lingers are their nicknames, half honor, half insult. That is the Norse legacy, great deeds wrapped always in human weakness. Archaeology reveals the fragments of their lives. Coins from Baghdad buried in Sweden, beads from India worn by women in Norway, toys carved of bone left in children's graves. Each fragment is small, but together they weave a vast story, a people who reached far, who lived fully, and who carried beauty into even the harshest places. Picture the great ship burials, vessels hauled ashore, filled with treasures, weapons, animals, even companions. The ship covered with earth, rising into a mound that still stands 1,000 years later. Imagine the silence as soil fell over planks, over shields, over the face of a man who had once sailed across the world, his ship no longer moving through water, but through time, carrying his memory to us. The gods themselves seemed to know they would fade, for in their myths they faced Ragnarok, the doom of all things. They did not promise endless safety. They promised struggle, courage, and renewal after ruin. Perhaps that is why their stories still resonate. They admit the truth, that all things end, and that endings can still carry beginnings inside them. Thor still swings his hammer when storms shake the earth. Odin still seeks wisdom in every riddle and question. Loki still laughs when plans collapse. They no longer rule, but they remain, not as faith, but as story. And story is a kind of immortality. The sagas themselves became the true ships of memory, carrying voices across centuries. They tell of battles and voyages, of feasts and insults, of gods and men. They tell us of a people who were fierce, flawed, practical, and often funny. They remind us that life is never only glory or only struggle, but a mixture of both, always bound together. And so the Viking Age closed, the sails furled, the oars rested, the longships pulled onto beaches for the last time, never to rise again, but the memory sailed on, carried in language, in law, in laughter. You can feel it even now, in words like sky, window, and husband, in place names scattered across England, in the bones of castles built by Norman descendants of raiders, in the sagas that still echo with both grandeur and jokes. The Vikings may have vanished, but their voice never did. There is comfort in this. for it shows us that even when ages pass, when gods fade, when ships rot into earth, what remains is memory, laughter, and story. They survive longer than stone, longer than fear, longer than power itself. So rest now and picture it. A longship rocking gently on still water at dusk. The crew quiet, their oars at rest. A hall glowing with firelight as a poet begins a tale. A field where a farmer pauses, looking up at thunder and muttering Thor's name with a half smile. A stone carved with runes, standing silent in the grass. This is the true ending, not a battle, not a collapse, but a fading into memory, a soft blending into the world that followed. The Viking Age is gone, but the Vikings remain. In every word, every joke, every story told again. And so the journey drifts to its close. The sails lower, the sea quiets, the hall falls still. The voices of gods and heroes fade into whispers, leaving you with calm, with memory, and with rest.